served in a variety of roles within the office, and as appellate chief, he personally wrote more than 200 briefs and argued 37 federal appeals. After receiving blue slips from both Tennessee senators, Mr. Ritz was confirmed by the Senate to be U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Tennessee by a voice vote in September of 2022. In that role, he serves as the Chief Federal Law Enforcement Officer for the 22 counties of the district and supervises the other attorneys in the office. As U.S. Attorney, Mr. Ritz created the National Security and Civil Rights Unit within the criminal division of his office. He also regularly meets with and convenes law enforcement and community partners to discuss violent crime reduction efforts and other priorities. I congratulate Mr. Ritz and his family on his nomination and look forward to hearing his testimony today. Senator Blackburn is asked to make remarks, and I now recognize her for 3 minutes. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me begin by saying just how disappointed I am that the Biden administration has once again shown little regard for the long-standing bipartisan tradition of consulting home state senators on judicial nominees. Senator Hagerty and I attempted to work in good faith with the administration. We identified highly qualified nominees to fill this vacancy, but unfortunately, the White House had other plans. It is abundantly clear that despite the White House assurances to the contrary, there was a backroom deal to appoint Mr. Ritz to this vacancy from the very start. But the most glaring example of the White House outright refusal to consult is the fact that they have not even bothered to ask what our objections to Mr. Ritz might be. Had they done so, I would have explained my serious concerns about his professional ethics, concerns that should alarm those in the White House pushing his nomination, and concerns that we have heard from many of his peers. In our country, every individual accused of a crime is entitled to due process under the law. That is a bedrock principle of justice. But that's not how Mr. Ritz has operated as a prosecutor. Mr. Ritz has been accused of using highly unethical bait-and-switch tactics to trick indigent criminal defendants into accepting plea deals they didn't agree to. And when defense attorneys pushed back, Mr. Ritz has been accused of making outright false statements to the court to cover up his misdeeds. Indeed, Mr. Ritz has chosen to surround himself with those who seemingly treat their ethical obligations with disdain. Mr. Ritz's deputy, for example, received a 1-year probation for prosecutorial misconduct. We have heard from many of his peers and colleagues. You don't have to take my word for it. Just ask Stephen Shankman, the former federal public defender for the Western District of Tennessee. Mr. Ritz has such a reputation for unethical behavior that when Mr. Shankman first heard reports of a prosecutor behaving unethically, he knew it had to be Kevin Ritz. Writing about Mr. Ritz, Mr. Shankman said, and I quote, "This is not the first, second, third, or whatever occasion that this sort of thing has occurred, but everyone should be aware of this unfortunate pattern of behavior. You should be aware, your clients should be aware, and you should proceed with extreme caution," end quote. You should proceed with extreme caution. What an admonition. Is that how the American citizen should be made to feel if they were to go into a courtroom with the presiding judge being Kevin Ritz? With an ethical record like this, I question how the ABA could give him any rating other than not qualified. He has no business representing the United States in a courtroom, let alone presiding as a judge with a lifetime appointment. But Mr. Ritz's record of unethical behavior isn't my only objection. Under his watch, As the chief federal law enforcement officer, the city of Memphis has become the most dangerous place to live in the United States. That is a fact. In 2023, Memphis had the most homicides in its history, and data shows that 2024 homicides are going to outpace 2023. Law and order has completely collapsed in Memphis under his leadership, and there is no more tragic example than last week's murder of a Memphis police officer. Officer Joseph McKinney was shot and killed on Friday by a criminal who had been arrested just weeks prior for 4 felonies, including unlawful possession of a weapon and possession of an illegal Glock switch. Make no mistake, the criminal would not have been out on the streets but for Mr. Ritz falling asleep at the wheel. His inaction has cost lives. Prior to Mr. Ritz's tenure, the U.S. Attorney's Office had a policy of charging 100% of prosecutable gun crimes. Why Mr. Ritz did not follow through on this, I do not understand. But we do know a police officer, a father, and a Memphian, they are dead because of Mr. Ritz's lack of leadership.
Senator, your time
Thank
has
you,
expired.
Mr. Chairman.
Let me say at the outset that Mr. Ritz will be before this committee for questions from all senators and have an opportunity to respond. Senator Blackburn asked for this special privilege of speaking out of turn, and I gave it to her and extended her time an additional 2 or 3 minutes in an effort to accommodate her in a fair fashion. Let me say at the outset, Mr. Ritz has been judged by the American Bar Association. To judge him and his prospective nomination, they contacted attorneys in the area as well as judges. Their conclusion, unanimously well qualified. Unanimously well qualified. If that sounds different than what you just heard, it is. Second, I want to address this notion that we have some kind of backroom deal here. The senator has been selective in talking about the facts that led to this nomination. Let me tell you the history. It takes a minute or two, but it's worth it. As many of you may know in this room, blue slips are literally blue slips of paper issued by this committee as a courtesy in order to seek input from colleagues on nominees from their home states. During the Obama administration, Senator Leahy chaired the committee and honored blue slips for both circuit and district court nominations. If a senator did not return a blue slip for a nomination from his state or her state, that individual nominee did not move forward. That was the tradition under Senator Leahy. As a result, Senate Republicans held multiple circuit seats open during the Obama administration that President Trump later filled. Both parties do that. But when Senate Democrats expressed reservations with President Trump's picks for circuit seats in their states, Senate Republicans reversed their thinking. They did away, the Republicans when they were in charge, did away with blue slips for circuit court vacancies and held hearings on 18 circuit court nominees who did not receive blue slips from their home state senators. I objected at the time, as did many of my colleagues, but we also repeatedly warned the Republicans were establishing new ground rules when it came to blue slips for circuit court judges. I've said it many times, there cannot be one set of rules for Republican nominees and another for Democratic nominees. So today and throughout this session, I am following the same standard the Senate Republicans set. Senate Republicans confirmed a nominee to the Third Circuit after the Trump White House refused to let Democratic home state senators even meet with him. Another Third Circuit nominee was informed that he would be nominated weeks before the Trump White House had a single conversation about the vacancy with Senator Casey of Pennsylvania. And the Trump White House counsel informed Senator Baldwin of Wisconsin during their very first conversation about a Seventh Circuit vacancy at the White House that they'd already selected a nominee without her knowledge. That doesn't seem like much consultation to me, but Senate Republicans said it was plenty. Given that history, the White House consulted with the Tennessee senators on this very vacancy, significantly more than precedent requires. The White House has been discussing this Senate seat with the Tennessee senators since August of 2023. They exchanged names of potential candidates in October of 2023. Mr. Ritz interviewed with members of the Tennessee Senators' staffs in both October and November 2023. The White House Counsel's Office interviewed the Tennessee Senators' suggested candidates in November of 2023. The White House then gave the Tennessee Senators the opportunity to choose from 3 candidates, including Mr. Ritz. The Tennessee Senators refused to do so. The White House also repeatedly offered the Tennessee Senators the opportunity to interview Mr. Ritz. Senator Blackburn did not take them up on the offer until March of this year, and Senator Haggerty did not conduct an interview of Mr. Ritz until yesterday. My Democratic colleagues would have been grateful to receive such courtesy from the Trump White House. But what did Senator Blackburn offer instead? Calling this a backroom deal. Senators Blackburn and Haggerty may have preferred another individual for the vacancy, but consistent with precedent set by former Republican chairs of the committee, we will proceed with the hearing for Mr. Ritz. It's now time to call
Mr. Chairman, there are inaccuracies in your statement. I'll be happy to submit a timeline and the fact that on Christmas Eve we received an email that they were going to nominate Mr. Ritz, but I'll submit those in writing for you.
Thank you very much, Senator. First panel is Mr. Ritz, and will you please approach the table as they change the nameplates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ritz, you are a political activist, aren't you?
I would not consider myself that at all, Senator.
Okay. When you were sworn in as U.S. Attorney, you gave a speech, didn't you?
I did.
Okay. Here's what you said. I'm going to quote from your speech. But you should know that justice for me is about more than putting people in prison. For me, it's also about who votes and how hard it is to cast that vote. It's about where pipelines go. It's about where bus routes go. Justice is about whether people in all zip codes can get along, whether women have access to health care, whether citizens have affordable housing or clean drinking water. Sometimes those are Department of Justice issues. Sometimes they are not. But for me, they're all justice issues. Did I read that accurately?
I believe so, Senator.
Okay. Did you really remove the Tennessee state flag from your conference room?
Senator, I appreciate you asking about this again. As the chief federal law enforcement.
Welcome. Did you do it?
So I felt it was fundamentally inappropriate when I gave press conferences and similar statements to the public to indicate or suggest somehow that I spoke for the state, which I don't under our system of federalism.
Are you embarrassed to be from Tennessee?
Not at all, Senator. I am from Tennessee, grew up as a public school kid in Tennessee.
But you were embarrassed to have the Tennessee flag.
That's not it at all, Senator.
Okay. You have a history of lying to your professional colleagues, don't you?
That's not true, Senator.
Okay. Do you know a former public defender named Stephen Shankman?
I knew him to a degree. I'm not sure we ever had any cases together. I knew who he was, yes.
Well, in a private email, not meant for public consumption, to another one of your professional colleagues, this is what Mr. Shankman said, talking about your lying. He said, "It is unfortunate that this is not the first, second, third, or whatever occasion that this sort of thing has occurred. But everyone should be aware of this unfortunate pattern of behavior. You should be aware," he said to the other lawyer, before the other lawyer dealt with you. "Your client should be aware, and you should proceed with extreme caution." Was Mr. Shankman lying?
To the degree he suggested that I acted unethically, that was not accurate, and it wasn't in any occasion, much less on numerous occasions.
Okay, let's talk about this case, United States v. Von Rico Weber, which you claim to not remember. But before I do that, A few seconds ago, you lied to Senator Hawley, didn't you?
I'm under oath, Senator. I did not lie.
You said you have no knowledge of any complaint, professional complaint made against you, didn't you?
I said I have no knowledge of any sort of formal complaint, and he read from a letter that I don't believe I ever saw.
And you were shocked. You
If
never heard of that before.
if there were a formal complaint, that, as I said, I had not known about that.
Okay. You were amazed.
I don't recall any of that.
Any-
I recall this Mr.
You
Weber's
have
case.
amnesia about it.
Again, I am unaware of any formal complaint or investigation. Certainly was not,
You believe in the Tooth Fairy?
Senator, I don't.
You believe in the Easter Bunny? Now, in this case, United States v. Von Rico Weber, you lied to the defense counsel. And the defense counsel then had to go before the court and withdraw a plea for his counsel. And a complaint was filed, about which you apparently have amnesia. And the Justice Department replaced you. And the lawyer from the Justice Department who replaced you, this is what the lawyer said. The new attorney said about you. Said these allegations against Mr. Ritz are, quote, serious. And it is taken so seriously, referring to the Department of Justice, by our office. That is one of the reasons I'm here, and Mr. Ritz will be more than likely be taken off this case because of those allegations. End quote. You lied to Senator Hawley, didn't you?
I didn't lie to the defense counsel in that case. I didn't lie today, Senator.
Now, my good friend Senator Ossoff asked you if you'd follow the law. And you said, yeah. But if you're lying to us today, we're stuck with you, aren't we?
Senator, I have not lied and did not lie in that case.
You just have amnesia.
I did not lie in that case. There was a written plea agreement with the entire agreement of the parties.
If you believe that, you believe Elvis is alive and running a small bait stand on Lake Erie. Shame on you.
Mr. Ritz, I asked our staff here who review all sorts of nominees' qualifications and backgrounds, how it would be possible that someone could file a complaint against someone and they didn't know it. They said it is not uncommon at all for OPR to decide not to act on that letter of complaint and not to proceed with it and not even to notify the person accused.
That's my understanding as well, but again, yes.
We think that's a fact. So this notion about amnesia or whatever it may be, it is credible, at least possible, that exactly as you portrayed it, they never notified you. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Mr. Ritz, for being here. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your 2023 U.S. Attorney Investiture speech, you highlighted the challenges you believe America faces and what justice means. You said, quote, "We're experiencing a long overdue reckoning with racism in the criminal justice system." Mr. Ritz, what part of the criminal justice system needs a long overdue reckoning?
Senator, what I was describing were a number of things that have happened in recent years in this country that framed, I would say, in some ways, the work that we do in the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Is the American justice system systematically racist?
That is not a sentiment that I hold. To the degree there is a definition of what being systematically racist means, I understand some individuals have pointed to disparities in sentencing and that type of thing, but that's not a view that I have.
So that's not a view that you have. That was your testimony. Well, you also said, quote, "There cannot be one rule of law for people who look like me and another for people of color." That sure sounds like the view you just said you didn't have. Do you believe that's our system, that our justice system has one rule of law for people that look like you and a different rule of law for people of color?
No, what I said is that absolutely we cannot have one rule of law for people who look like me and another for people of color. We cannot have one rule of law for the powerless and another for the... There's just one rule of law. That's what I said.
You also said, when asked if the criminal justice system is systematically racist, you said, quote, "There are structural barriers and disparate outcomes that communities of color experience in our society, separate and apart from any individual's views or intentions." Now, that again seems to be saying the same thing that you're saying you weren't saying. I'm just trying to understand what your views are.
And Senator, that was my attempt in that written question to grapple with, again, what was being asked by systematic racism. I understand some have pointed to structural barriers and disparate outcomes.
So what are the barriers and outcomes you're referring to?
I can think of one prominent example that I've had some experience with, which is the disparity in cocaine sentencing between crack sentencing and powder sentencing. This body has addressed those disparities on multiple occasions, and that has been, as I understand it, something that people have addressed as a result of disparities.
Okay, you also said in responses to questions for the record that, as the Attorney General has explained, everyone has implicit biases. So what are your implicit biases?
Senator, I understand implicit bias to refer to unconscious bias that exists below the level of consciousness, and so to the degree I have implicit biases, I think we all do. I think that's partly the point.
So everyone's a racist whether they know it or not?
And I would say that everyone might have implicit biases, and I don't know what.
So what's the difference between bias and prejudice?
I think there can be a lot of overlap in those things. It depends, I think, on the context.
So you're saying everyone is prejudiced?
That's not what I said, Senator.
You just said everyone has implicit biases, and you said that bias and prejudice, I think your words were, there's a lot of overlap.
I think that's right, and I understand implicit bias, and I'm not an expert on the subject, to refer to a set of biases that may exist under a conscious level. So,
since you talk about these implicit bias issues, have you taken a so-called implicit bias test?
We received training that was put on during the last administration in our office on implicit bias. I attended that training in our office.
And what did you take a test?
I don't believe there was a test associated with that, Senator.
Okay, you also said, quote, "But you should know that for justice, for me, is about more than putting people in prison. For me, it's also about who votes and how hard it is to cast that vote. It's about where pipelines or bus routes go. Justice is about whether people in all zip codes can get a loan, whether women have access to health care." That's an interesting statement, and in reading it, what's striking is that that's de-emphasizing the core role of a U.S. attorney. The last I checked, a U.S. attorney is not in the policy business of deciding where pipelines go. That's the role of environmental activists and left-wing activists, but is not supposed to be a U.S. attorney. Why was your focus elsewhere?
Senator, and the very next thing I said was that those are not issues that we deal with on a day-to-day basis in the U.S. Attorney's Office, where we are primarily focused on enforcing criminal laws. I was seeking to place justice as a broad concept at the center of, to place our work within justice as a broad concept.
So do you agree that Memphis is one of the most dangerous cities in the nation?
It is. We have an intolerable amount of violent crime, and that's why there's no higher priority for us in our office.
Well, there's no higher priority except for pipelines, except for bus routes, except for bank loans, except for implicit bias, except for the fact that everyone is prejudiced. All of those other things are what you're focused on talking about instead of actually locking up bad guys who are murdering and raping and hurting people.
In those same comments, Senator, I said that we don't apologize for seeking significant prison sentences, and that's at the core of what we do. When we have serious violent crime, we seek serious sentences and consequences.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Cruz, and thank you, Mr. Ritz. We appreciate your being here. You may receive some questions in writing. If you'll respond in a prompt fashion, we'd appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
We now make room for the second panel.